Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual forum of the Texas Lyceum on the media. My name is Creighton Webb, and I have the pleasure of being a Texas Lyceum Director, class of 2018, and I'm also the owner and CEO of SunWest Communications based in Dallas, Texas. This is actually the 9th virtual forum the Texas Lyceum has hosted since the COVID-19 outbreak. March 25th is when we started doing these virtual forums on all kinds of topics that are affecting the state of Texas, from energy to philanthropy, higher education, K through 12, the economy, and of course, as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about the media. The whole idea that was brought together by the current Texas Lyceum president, Laura Dixon, was to bring Texas leaders together to talk about other Texas issues in a safe forum where questions could be asked. And of course, this is in the absence of the normal events that the Texas Lyceum normally hosts on an annual basis. What's interesting about all of these panels and all of these forums is each of our panelists have all been alums of the Texas Lyceum. So we're a proud group, and these folks have a lot of expertise to offer. So I also want to thank our sponsors who've allowed for this alternate method of thought leadership and sharing ideas to continue to go forward. I want to alert you that if you're interested in being a director of the Texas Lyceum, that nominations are now open. So if you've got someone that you'd like to nominate, who you believe is part or should be part of the next generation of leaders for the Lone Star State, you can check out that application and those nominations at texaslyceum.org. And that's also going to be the location if you'd like to see and look back at some of the other forums, the other 8 forums we've held over the last couple of months. I want to let you know that if you are a member of the news media, other than our 3 panelists, if you're a member of the news media, today's forum is open to you. We're glad that you're here, but the conversation that you're about to hear is off the record. So we would ask that you would respect that. Of course, who knows, considering the color and background of our panelists and esteemed panelists, what they might say and whether they consider it off the record or not. As I mentioned, the recording is available and is going to be available in a couple of days at texaslyceum.org. So, of course, fair to say that the media has been on the front line, not necessarily like healthcare workers, but certainly impacted by COVID-19 and the way that they cover news. In many ways, as we all know, the landscape and business model of the media has changed dramatically in the last 10 years and even the last 5 years, and continues to change, even just from a business perspective. But of course, the media is in many ways driving the conversation. One of the most provocative questions that I've heard someone ask over the last 10 weeks was, considering that the heart of the national, if not international news media is in New York City, if the same kind of outbreak would have taken place in a Lincoln, Nebraska, or a Boise, Idaho, would New York have shut down? So with that, I'm sure we've got a fantastic conversation with our esteemed panelists ahead, who again, as I mentioned, are all Lyceum alums. It's my pleasure to introduce to you now our moderator, who's a member of the Texas Lyceum class of 2015. He's the president and founder of Outreach Strategists. Let me turn it over now to our moderator, Mustafa Tamiz. Mustafa, take it away.
Well, hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I am incredibly excited for the conversation we're about to embark with Evan Smith, who is the founder of Texas Tribune, runs the Texas Tribune. And Evan's got a long history in Texas politics and how he talks about policy, and you know, to many extents, some people fear him a great deal because he could be very grouchy when he asks you a question. But for the most part, in the Texas Lyceum, he has a lot of affection amongst all of us. Erica Grider, who's Metro columnist at my hometown paper, the Houston Chronicle, you know, has written for some shady publications prior to that. The Economist, for God's sakes, what do they know? And since she's been in Houston, she's been able to pull a lot of disparate type of ideas that affect our region into that one very pithy and important column. So thank you for what you do for Houston. And then Chris Boyd. Chris, you know, before we got on, I said, is it is it Kira FM or is it Kira? And she said, it's just Kira. Everybody knows it as that, right? Not only she produced the program, she's an on-air host, and very glad to have all three of you with us today. I want to start our conversation in something that Creighton was saying, that if something had occurred in some place other than New York, would we get the same kind of coverage? Would New York have shut down or not? I think sometimes when something happens in New York, people think, oh, the press is there. That's why it's got shaped a little differently. Let me start with you, Evan. Is that the case? Is where something happens affect how people perceive it, or is it just the number of deaths?
If you're talking about a crisis like the one we're in the middle of now, where you've had so many deaths spread out over all 50 states and around the world, where the global economy, not just the US economy, but the global economy is in free fall, of course the media would cover it if it wasn't centered in New York. If for whatever the reason there had been a terrorism attack, not at the World Trade Center in New York, but at the Sears Tower in Chicago, or at someplace in Texas, or someplace in Florida, the media would have rushed to cover that, because you cover a singular event by deploying all the resources available to you. You flood the zone. And the fact that New York was a hotspot, one of several hotspots, obviously the worst in our country, but one of several. Notwithstanding, I think if this happened somewhere else, of course, the media would have absolutely raced to cover this story.
Erica, I wanted to pick up on a thought. You have a unique perspective. You report it, but now you're a columnist.
Mm-hmm.
You're able to opine on things that sometimes connect the dots that in the news that other people can't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Often it's said, public opinion drives public policy.
Mm-hmm.
Public opinion is shaped by the media.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people look at that is the media shaping public opinion. I often say it's what people see in the media.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at your newsroom and how reporters are reporting COVID-19,
mm-hmm.
do you feel like that there's some important stories getting left behind? And if so, what can we do about that?
Well, it's interesting, and I'm glad you asked about the stories might be getting left behind. Our newsroom's been disbanded, so we've been working from home, working remotely since March, and we have some staff in the office, editors, page designers, and so on. But mostly we've been out and about doing our work and trying to report as well, which is of course a challenge because we're trying to observe the precautions as journalists. I mean, we're wearing masks, we have hand sanitizer. I have a colleague who has a Tyvek suit. It can be dangerous as far as the exposure we're getting through the actual reporting. We have a Google document we've put up to kind of just get sources in here from different Houstonians. We're asking Houstonians to kind of write to us or reach out to us. And I'd ask people on this call too, if you hear of a story that we're not covering, we'd like to hear about it. Of course, part of the challenge in reporting through this crisis has been people are staying at home, which is what they're being encouraged to do. So the gatherings that you'd see where you're used to reporting have, of course, been somewhat suppressed since this began.
Chris, we talk about the big cities, but you've spent, your professional career on the border. What's happening there that people, from a news standpoint, how is it being covered, the COVID-19 in smaller towns, smaller markets?
Well, the show is in smaller markets. I want to be really clear that I haven't reported from El Paso for more than 20 years, so I want to make sure that no one takes me to be an expert. I do still have friends and family there. I think there's some concern about undercounts, especially from across the border. I know a lot of people are affected by closures at the border and limitations on cross-border traffic. In terms of, we're in 11 states around the country, a lot in Texas, but also some smaller markets elsewhere in the country. I think people are feeling this everywhere. There are some rural areas that haven't had many cases, but there are surprising numbers of cases, these pockets of infection popping up in really small places. And so I feel like this is something that's really affecting people in major cities. Maybe that's where most of the coverage comes from, but it's also, there are really concerning concentrations of infection elsewhere.
Mustafa, you asked the question of Erica, what is being left behind as we all race to cover this story? To me, there's an obvious answer of a whole category of stories that we're not covering or not covering nearly enough or as much as we would have been, and that's the political season. The elections, we've got significant elections happening all across the state of Texas. We don't just have a presidential race that is likely to be the closest presidential race in 20 years or more. going back really 24 years, if you think about it, to 1996, when Bob Dole beat Bill Clinton in Texas by 5 points, the closest presidential election in Texas in the modern era, not just at the presidential level, but we have a handful of congressional races that are going to be really interesting, really close. A couple, Mustafa and Erica, near where you are. The race, Lizzie Fletcher's seat, she'll be challenged as a freshman by a very serious Republican and well-funded Republican challenger in Congressional District 7. The Dan Crenshaw seat could be very interesting depending upon what happens in national politics. Of course, Fort Bend County is interesting up in Chris's part of the state, the Colin Allred seat, similarly held by a freshman with a serious and well-funded challenger. The seat in Carrollton, Texas, that Kenny Marchant held for a while, an open seat where you've got a really competitive race between Republicans and a Democrat to be determined by the runoff. We're not talking about those races hardly at all. Remember when we were going to talk about how the Democrats were going to take back the Texas House, how they were 9 seats away from taking back control heading into the next session? Is anybody talking about that anymore? I think that the entire political season as a story for journalism has been completely pushed to the side, partly because it's gauche to talk about elections and fundraising when people are dying. And when the economy's in collapse, when we have double-digit, unprecedented unemployment in this state, but partly because there's no bandwidth in newsrooms to report on this stuff. And look, the newsrooms that are going to come out of this, Mustafa, I hope we'll talk about this, are going to be smaller in most cases than they were going in. And so there are going to be fewer reporters to cover this incredibly important singular election season story that largely is going ignored right now because of the coronavirus.
You know, one thing that we're getting in this COVID era is that the cracks in our society, whatever they were, are just more exasperated because of this type of crisis, right? So when everyone was talking about the newsrooms, I mean, you saw basically that the newspaper industry was starting to, you know, just for the last decade, it's just seen a decline, right? And so you get into this era now, you wonder how many are going to be able to keep up, because you saw the advertising rates just drop out, right? Just completely vanquish. So Erica, like the Houston Chronicle, I often talk about Houston Chronicle as the third largest circulation for a Sunday paper after the New York Times and LA Times. Big paper in Texas, right? What's happening there?
I mean, we've been fortunate as far as newsrooms go. We haven't had any layoffs. We're not expecting any layoffs, and that's been true for the San Antonio Express News, our sister paper in Texas as well, also owned by Hearst. We, of course, have seen tremendous traffic to our website, so that's been good, right? I mean, especially in March and April, just a surge of interest from Houstonians, as you'd imagine, people trying to get information. The whole newsroom sort of changed its activities. So things like, obviously, with the sports section, the sports reporters don't have sports to report on. They've been reporting on other things. We've all become, to some extent, COVID reporters now. And we've had, you know, we've sort of restructured the paper, the print edition itself, to create more coverage of those stories. But yeah, as you mentioned, as Evan mentions, I mean, advertising is a challenge. The entire regional economy is just being shellacked not only by the coronavirus and the fallout, by the turmoil in the oil industry. So that's been a difficult spot for us, as you'd imagine, and it will be going forward, we think.
Evan, you've kind of like in a big way a pioneer in just nonprofit journalism and also in just the online journalism, right? You know what I thought where we were headed was more nonprofit journalism, but in COVID, fundraising has gotten hard. You talked about political fundraising, but fundraising for any nonprofit has gotten hard. Where do you think is that nonprofit model going to emerge out of this, or are there challenges there too?
Well, I'd say, first of all, Mustafa, everybody in journalism is nonprofit. Some of us are intentionally nonprofit. Many are unintentionally nonprofit, right? That's one of the consequences of this. Knock on wood, our fundraising has held up over the course of the last few months, and we anticipate being able to hold on to the side of the boat, as it were, for the rest of the year. No layoffs, no furloughs, no salary cuts, because we've run our nonprofit like a business, like a for-profit. Our fundraising has been strong. The importance of our work is evident to everybody. Today, we, Erica, Chris, all of us in this business are reporting on things that are literally the difference between life and death for people. Keeping people reliably informed has never been more important. Houston Chronicle saw a massive spike in its traffic. Our March traffic to the Tribune site was 5 times what it is on average, more than 3 times the historic high previously. April was down a little bit from March, but still significantly up. For our purposes, Mustafa, all that matters is, are we realizing our public service mission? And the answer today is absolutely. And if we do that, the support comes in. My brothers and sisters, our brothers and sisters in the news media across the country, across Texas, are not as fortunate to be able to say that they're holding on to the side of the boat. There are layoffs at newspapers all across Texas, across the country. Whole news organizations are disappearing off the map.
Mm-hmm.
And what's probably happening here is that there's been an acceleration of what was inevitable, that there was going to be contraction in the news media over time anyway, and this has just sped it up.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us who are left standing at the end of this are going to have a much larger responsibility to tell the stories that need to be told to communities that have no sources of news. I admire my friend Chris in part because her show does provide a lifeline to a lot of small communities.
Yeah.
And in those small communities, if you don't have Chris Boyd's show, or you don't have the Texas Tribune offering its stories for free on the front page of the Wichita Falls paper, or the San Angelo paper, or the Lufkin paper, there is really no coverage of these issues. So we all have to work that much harder in this contracted environment, constrained environment, to be able to do this important work. And some fortunately we're able to do it.
Evan, I'm glad to hear that you guys are doing well. That was my understanding to begin with. I feel like the nonprofit model, which is how we operate as a public radio station, has actually put us in a better position than a lot of other organizations because we didn't rely on advertising. The Dallas Morning News, and I don't speak for them, but they're starting to talk about subscriptions as memberships. It's starting to feel like I know nothing about their long-term plans, but they're talking not just about a transactional subscription now, but about a membership, about patronage of journalism. And certainly that's what we've done. We've also been in a good financial position as an organization. It's a little bit different at NPR, which has had some salary freezes and some cuts, at least temporarily. We've hired people since COVID-19 has begun. We have a couple of open positions now that we intend to fill. We've been really fortunate because we've operated with, sort of within our means, because we have always relied on support. And like you, we've seen that people who need this coverage are digging really deep in our limited fundraising to make sure that we stay on the air.
Mm-hmm.
Let me take our discussion in a little different direction. I saw a 60-minute report. You were talking about politics with Sid Miller as a champion of rural hospitals. And he was delivering aid to rural hospitals. He was advocated with Abbott in terms of trying to get more funding there. When we look at a lot of the smaller markets in the rural parts of town, I mean, you talked about the fact that we don't get all the coverage there, right? Chris, a lot of the radio stations that you're working on do talk about some of those issues. But I'm wondering, like, as the economy begins to shrink, right? Things like rural hospitals, 150 of them now, 60 of them are likely to go bankrupt after this. How do we, as a state, as a nation, right? We're coming up with our biennial budget really soon in the Texas legislature, right? Erica, do you see, like, what should be our focus? Not just from the news coverage, but as Americans and Texans, what should be our focus?
As policymakers, for those of you who are policymakers, I think we have to anticipate the next budget cycle in the Texas legislature, which begins in January with dread, right? It's going to be an incredible amount of needs, not just with healthcare, rural hospitals, with education, with worker support, with unemployment insurance. I mean, it's just going to be a really, really, really tough budget cycle. And I'm starting to think about ways we can kind of cover those stories going into the session. I know talking to legislators on both sides of the aisle, they're aware of how serious the needs will be. But I think certainly going into it with an awareness, it's going to be a tough session. And the issues that are disproportionately impacting rural areas, we'll hear about from the legislators from those areas, but it is hard, as Evan says, with the shuttering of so many small outlets in these towns, just for us to have eyes on those communities, what's happening there. So I don't have a solution to that, certainly. I mean, Evan, Chris, do you have a sense of how we're going to find the money in the couch cushions?
I think it's going to be an open session. I would totally agree with you about that. It's going to be like 2011. That'll be the most recent session that we'll make comparisons to, where you had a shortfall of $15 or $20 billion. We had a cut to public education. And this is, of course, coming out of a session that was historic or near historic in terms of the investment in public education, the relief offered to property taxpayers. Everybody was lining up saying heading into this session, well, last session was a public education session. This session should be a healthcare session, or this session should be a transportation session, or this session should be a higher ed session. And now it's going to be a bloodbath. Mustafa, more rural hospitals closed in Texas before the pandemic, over the last 10 years than in any other state. We have a terrible track record in terms of healthcare in rural communities. There are still 3 million people living in rural Texas, even with the urbanization of this state over time. There are still 3 million people living in rural communities in this state, more than the populations of 18 states. So it's not a question of whether we still spend money in rural Texas for healthcare, education, and what have you. It's we have to find it, right? And to Erica's point, non-rural legislators are not advocating for rural Texas because they've got to take care of their constituents. And so it becomes this real balancing act. How do you take care of this massive part of the state? And to Erica's point, there aren't news organizations holding people in power accountable in most of these places because most of the news sources are drying up. So it's a real challenge, and there's no obvious answer for what to do.
And the reason why I posed it this way, Chris, because if you think about our initial conversation where we started, where this happened in New York, is it being more covered because it's in New York, right? And that's really not true in this case. But a lot of times our news outlets, our major news outlets, are in big urban centers because that's where reporters tend to be, right? And so if 3 million people live across Texas in rural areas, which don't have big newspapers, big ways to report the conditions that are happening there, how do we have a session where those things are included? Easy answer. It's an easy question.
I mean, you have to make sure that people understand it's an issue. And I think in terms of I can't speak to how you get the legislature to make this their priority when you have a lot of very powerful urban lawmakers. In terms of making sure it gets covered, I think it speaks a little bit to the way we recruit and making sure that we don't only bring in journalists who come from those big cities and who come from exclusively Ivy League schools. I think it really takes looking for people, and they exist, they're out there, looking for people who have really different backgrounds. One thing that NPR has done in recent years is try to cover the issue of guns in America. And we really had to look for people who didn't look like the standard NPR reporter who actually understood guns and gun culture and the difference between different things. I think it's very similar for rural issues of all kinds. Healthcare, certainly, but there are a lot of other important issues as well, water rights and that sort of thing, that affect rural areas in a very different way than they affect urban areas. And we have to find people who at least have knowledge of those places and backgrounds so that when there is a big story, they're not just parachuting in, trying to collect as many facts as they can and then get back to their newsroom in the city somewhere.
Mustafa, I would say that to Chris's point of the other issues other than healthcare, here's one that I think is going to be at the top of the list next session, and that's access to broadband in rural communities.
Yeah, that's a good one.
As public and higher education and economic development have had to move largely online, we have an inequality of access to that opportunity that is exacerbated by geography, but it's also exacerbated by race and by poverty.
Right.
I saw one statistic during this pandemic that said that something like 25% of rural households do not have reliable access to broadband. When kids are having to go to school from home, homeschooling, working from home, as we all are as grown-ups working from home, or higher education is moved at least partly, if not entirely, online. What do you do if you don't have access to broadband? That's got to be a priority issue for, and then of course, in these rural communities, back to healthcare, telemedicine only works if you have tele. And in these communities, if you don't have access to rural broadband, that is not an option. So we need to figure out how we can elevate that issue, probably going to happen on its own, to the top of the agenda next session.
And I would say, if I can add one sort of note of some optimism, not about the session overall, but I think that we will see some coalition between rural Republicans and urban Democrats, right? I mean, you're seeing that a bit already these are the areas that are going to be most targeted by the crisis, that are going to see the most severe disparities, most severe socioeconomic and racial disparities. And these are going to be the areas, the legislators who don't want to get involved in another round of the culture war kind of fights we've seen in the past few sessions, right? I mean, you think about, is there going to be a lot of bandwidth for a bathroom bill in the next session? I can't imagine that, because there's going to be too many serious concerns. I say this and I'm like, have I been not covering Texas politics for 10 years? We could see that come up, right? But I think it's going to get short shrift compared to, the comparatively easy climbs of 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
No, I started thinking about this when I was looking at Chris, because there's going to be federal budget cuts and people are going to look at potentially cutting NPR budget, right? Like, I mean, there's going to be a thing from some even conservatives that'll say, why do we need this? In the end, it's really the most important thing for those rural constituencies that they want to serve. And I hope that that point comes across in federal funding when they start talking about NPR.
Right. We'll be okay. We're a big station in a big market, and we have really generous donors, and we have a large pool. The places we're really worried about are the places where there aren't a lot of local radio stations that do any other coverage. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of Native American reservations where an NPR outpost may be the only sort of local media they possibly have. It's really important, and it's not the big stations. I mean, I think it's like 9% of our annual budget, and we account for that so that we don't count on it. Mm-hmm. Some of these stations are literally, the lights are kept on by mm-hmm. that federal funding, and it is going to be a problem. I think the perception that somehow public radio only serves a certain kind of person, a certain kind of information, has hurt us. I think it's inaccurate, but it's something to think about. But if that funding gets cut, the people who are going to be hurt are the people in rural America.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question here from Glenwood Hills talking about more of the niche media, ethnic media, African American papers, Latino papers, sometimes even in different constituencies. That sometimes that you need that expertise in order to write deep enough stories.
Right.
Where do you see, Evan, starting from you, where do you see that headed in the coming year?
Well, the economics of niche media are more challenged. These are smaller operations. They work on smaller budgets, but that's not a positive, that's a negative, because an economic downturn like this can be the difference between survival and, I just think it's hard in this environment. And, we know that there are economic disparities in all businesses. We saw during the PPP distribution that Black-owned and Latino-owned businesses had a much harder time getting access to the kinds of funds that would allow them to stay in business. And I think that there's a version of that in the media business as well. Look, we are all in this together. And I think one of the things that I've been really interested in the 11 years we've had the Tribune now in business is the ability to work in partnership and figure out how we can help one another and lift up some of these smaller news organizations by providing them with some of the resources that they would not otherwise have available to them. There's no question that those news organizations are critical to the communities they serve, and it would just make things which are already bad significantly worse if they went away. I worry for them in this downturn. I will tell you that for sure.
David Kim just asked a question. I'll start with you, Erica. Maybe we can go around on this.
Sure.
How would you evaluate the coverage of COVID-19? Just if you take a step back and you look at media as a whole, how would you assess that?
How would I evaluate it? I mean, it's been interesting and difficult. There's challenges being posed, even by things just like the data we have. All the data we have is subject to interpretation with an asterisk, right? Because of the lack of testing, the slow rate of that. We haven't had, I would say, as much transparency as one would like to see from the state initially. We've had these sort of conflicting layers of state and local orders that have been kind of hard to navigate through. I think on certain fronts, it's been really good coverage. I know certainly as a journalist, I've enjoyed hearing more from scientists and more from public health experts than we usually do in the news. I mean, those are, experts, and we have a lot of expertise here in the state that we have access to, and people have been very generous with their time as far as helping us think through and walk through the science. But certainly with the hue and cry and commotion of like the cable news discussion of COVID, the kind of distortion, I mean, like the story set in New York, and New York, of course, is, a hot spot for this, but also in some ways different from the communities we cover, right? So compared to Houston, New York is denser, it has more public transit, usage, so there's going to be more risk factors for COVID. So I think keeping those contexts in mind, it's been a challenge. We're working through it. We're trying our best to navigate. None of us are epidemiologists. We're talking to a lot of them these days. And, it's still a work in progress. We're still in the early phases of this. So,
Evan, in the age of Trump, what comes out of the White House, how do you process it as a journalist? How do we report on it? And I mean, I'm a Democrat. I have some partisan links in this, but I think we've all been somewhat troubled. How do you think about that?
Our job in journalism is to search for the truth and tell people what we find. Sometimes we find it and sometimes we don't. But we work our hardest to find it. And if we can't find it, we try to tell people why we can't. Sometimes we can't find it because the truth is not knowable, but sometimes it's obscured by people in power. Sometimes willfully and sometimes not willfully. Erica alluded to the data and the difficulty that we've had trying to untangle the data. I'll give you just one example. Apparently, the reason that the testing numbers in Texas, as reported, have been as high as they have over the last period is because the state Department of Health Services, Department of State Health Services, has commingled antibody tests with COVID-19 tests. And they're now having to disentangle that and report the data more transparently. There is so much about this that we don't know. And yet the media is, viewed on the one hand as supposed to know everything and tell everybody everything. And when we can't, we get criticized for that. And on the other hand, when we report things honestly and fairly and accurately, we get accused of doing so with an agenda. I can't tell you how many times I've read on social media or heard on television that the media manufactured this entire thing. That somehow we, in reporting what was going on, have done so either for political reasons, to attack or take down the president in this administration, or to gin up some kind of public health crisis that doesn't exist. And, I'm 54 years old, Mustafa. I still wake up every day astonished at the world that I confront and astonished at what people are willing to believe or disbelieve. There has never been a harder time to try to do this work and stay off the field of play, wear the uniform of no team but the public, or of Texas in our case, right? And try to report fairly thoroughly and accurately, because there is so much bullshit thrown around, so much noise that you have to wade through. And I think that the media has, on balance, done a very good job of telling us what we need to know. What we know because the media has told us. And so I'm a little defensive about that, I'll confess, but I really believe that the media has done a good job on balance here.
I think we're trying to sort of be aware of the known unknowns too, right? And the unknown unknowns. I mean, but there are a lot of known and unknown unknowns in this. It's been interesting too to watch. I mean, as Evan mentions, political coverage has kind of been quiet lately, partly because the campaigns themselves have been sort of quiet, especially like the state and local campaigns, but are quieter than usual for this time in a cycle. But there is a real partisan valence to how this crisis is being perceived that I don't remember from previous disasters, including even Harvey, which wasn't that long ago, right? So we have this era of peak polarization, which we know about. It's still being fomented by some high levels of government, but it's been interesting and sort of difficult to see it happen, right? I mean, for there to be a partisan disjunct, and we're seeing it in polling as well, on just the nature of public health crisis. I mean, I understand it partly due to the emergence of this coronavirus first on the coast, on the West Coast and in the Northeast, which are, of course, pretty democratic areas. But it's been a strange and difficult and troubling thing, too, is we're trying to give our readers the best information they need for their health this time.
I think there are also some challenges in trying to reflect the really diverse experiences that people have with this. So almost everyone is affected by some kind of lockdown order or stay at home or shelter in place. But your situation is really different if you have a relative who's fighting COVID either at home or in a hospital versus someone who is trying to work from home with small children who are trying to do school, and you may or may not have the proper bandwidth to make sure that's possible, or having to go to work every day regardless of your age, regardless of your health conditions, because you've been decided to be an essential worker, versus people who, there's still a lot of stuff online that is reflects some people's experience of like, I need another craft, or I need to figure out what to cook tonight. Those are all happening for people. And with the exception of the very last one, they can feel quite urgent. But if your experience in the very thing that you're reading or hearing or watching doesn't sound like what's happening to you, it's really easy to dismiss the coverage as somehow not relevant to you.
Yeah,
I think Erica's point about how this is unprecedented, or at least in recent memory, these kinds of crises happen. There were a certain number of 9/11 truthers. There are significantly more coronavirus truthers out in the world.
Yeah. And
it's a perfect pandemic in some respects for a moment when we can't even agree on basic facts in this country right now. Right. And in some ways, we got the pandemic we deserved, given the environment out there.
Yeah.
Let me let me pull something in that what you were saying about social media. I think you kind of alluded to it. Like a quarter of the accounts on Twitter are fake accounts. Right? So when you say 9/11 truthers, we didn't have this robust social media after 9/11, right? So you're going into an era where people are able to dig into a side, and all of a sudden, some of it is just fake, right? Some of it's just tough stuff. We've seen protests happening in front of different state capitals. It started out where people with guns were showing up saying, "Open the state." Now we're seeing protests where body bags are being put in front of state capitol, right? So as you look at some of this, which is kind of AstroTurf protests on all sides of this, right? I'll use the president's words, on all sides. How, you know, on NPR, one of the most trusted brands, right, when it comes to public, how do you discern between what is just astroturfing of whether social media or protests that just are made bigger than they are, versus where people actually are when it comes to something?
Well, if people are showing up, whether they were prodded there by some kind of troll or fake account, if people are showing up, that's reflecting their experience and their perception of things. At some point, it almost doesn't matter if the origins of that were fake. I mean, it's helpful to be able to dig that out and tell people that they were sort of led there under a false flag. But if you have 100 people standing in front of a courthouse, it doesn't matter who decided that they should be there. People are feeling that way, and they're spreading those messages. I mean, what's really concerning is that I think a lot of people have not been trained to sort of consider their desire to have whatever it is that they're consuming reflect their worldview. I think most people sort of understand this if they've been well educated, but a lot of people haven't been well educated and haven't been, you know, like the danger of conspiracy theory is that the more you say to disprove it, the more someone thinks you've got to be lying. And I don't know, that's how do you change human nature, Mustafa? And I'm not quite sure how we do that except by reminding people that, you know, that sort of tearing into the information that you're receiving from mainstream sources is not necessarily a bad thing to do, but, you know, the other things that you're consuming deserve even more scrutiny. And I think a lot of people who are desperate for some sense of control in this whole thing are really reluctant to do that.
I saw a poll that said 60% of Americans can't name the 3 branches of government, and 20% can't name one branch, right? In that environment with this echo chambers of social media where we go, where we already believe, we believe more. Evan, what's the way that we educate the public about the issues that are most valuable to them? In a state of 28 million people, there are a lot of important issues that don't get heard. How do we talk about them?
Well, I'm just listening to you talk about those polls, and I'm shaking my head, not because I don't believe it, but because I do believe it. I was reminded recently that in 2010, one of the earliest polls that we did in partnership with the University of Texas, we found that more than 30% of Texans believed humans and dinosaurs walked the earth at the same time. They thought that the Flintstones was a documentary. And I have to tell you, I am never surprised by the poll findings like the ones you just cited, because you think, how can people have been alive long enough, that long, and not know a branch of government, really? You go to war with the army you have, as Donald Rumsfeld said. You know, this is the public we have. And we have to do our very best job, not being contemptuous or critical, look down our noses at people. These are not deplorables, right? These are Americans. And we in the news media have to understand that we have to pitch the work that we do to very different audiences, often at the same time. And sometimes that means giving people what they want, and sometimes it means giving people what they don't know they want or don't know they need, because we are in the education business as well as in the journalism business. And you know, I just think we have to just roll with the conditions on the ground. Right now, there are an awful lot of people who are, back to the previous conversation, lining up on the side of whatever the opposite of public health facts is. And we have to do our best to try to tell people, you know, no, injecting bleach into your lungs is not going to save you, no matter who you hear it from. And you can't believe you're even having to have that conversation, Mustafa.
Let me ask you.
I go back to what I said. The job of journalism is to search for the truth and tell people what we find.
Well, let me ask you, Evan and Chris and Mustafa, all of us experienced observers of Texas politics and the delightful eccentricities thereof. Have you been surprised by the relative lack of anti-lockdown protests in the state thus far? I mean, I was looking at those pictures from Michigan, and I was like, we're actually not seeing that in Texas. So
well, we've opened up very quickly. I mean,
true,
if you look at the leaders of the bigger cities in this state, a lot of them would have preferred to stay locked down, or at least to have a modicum of local control that they have been denied. Right. That's constitutional, but it's not necessarily what local jurisdictions feel like is right for their people. But I think that's part of the reason.
Yeah. We didn't have protests with long guns inside the Capitol threatening
this time
opposite the governor like Michigan.
Yeah.
But there was an Alex Jones sighting at the Capitol, which is always a delight. I think he was threatening to cannibalize his neighbors or something. But
yeah.
We had our version of this, but I think Chris has made the right point here, which is we opened up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And time will tell whether that was a good decision or a bad decision. I don't know that any of us knows.
Yeah.
Yet.
It's like we're in an experiment where the success of the experiment is contingent on us, not following the orders from the governor now. I mean, there's still, if this goes well, it'll be partly because we're still following local orders from Judge Jenkins in Dallas County, from Judge Hidalgo here in Harris County, and elsewhere.
Well, in a lot of ways, the protests have been not at the state capitol. The protests have been more against orders, people who served in public office and were at least semi-reputable, talking about how Clay Jenkins is a Nazi or a tyrant, and people who are trying to, rip into Judge Hidalgo over mask orders or, bail plans that she has in place. I mean, we can politicize a mango. We can politicize anything. Mm-hmm. And we politicize this thing, and I'm not really sure that this is a moment for politics, or at least let me say, I think a lot of the people who complain about how this crisis is being politicized by other people are politicizing it while they're saying that other people are politicizing it. Right?
I do want to note that Judge Jenkins is a Lyceum alum. I think
is he?
In my class of 09. Yeah.
I think that's when I met Judge Jenkins, actually. It was in a Lyceum. That's exactly.
That's a good class.
I've always liked him. So let me take this in a different way. We're talking about COVID-19. We're talking about how in Texas we've opened up early. We're seeing Texas now as one of the states where COVID-19 is growing quickly, but it's not necessarily in the bigger cities, but it's in Huntsville, right? Mm-hmm. It's in Amarillo. And we come back to the same things, right? That in these smaller markets, in these rural areas, the challenges, although the communities are smaller, the challenges are sometimes bigger.
Right.
And I find that the people that sometimes take positions from there are contrary to their own detriment, right? In Huntsville, Texas, we're seeing this growing epidemic in the prison system. Where's that prison story in Texas? Because certainly we have our share of prisons, more than most states.
I would say respectfully, you ought to be reading Jolie McCullough in the Texas Tribune, who is all over the story of infections in the Texas prison system, and the way that Alexa Ura has been all over the story of infections in the meatpacking plants. Yeah. Alexa was the one who last week reported that the JBS plant up in the Panhandle refused the offer of free testing of all of its employees from the state. And within an hour of Alexa's story in the Texas Tribune, the plant reversed course and decided to test its employees. Those Panhandle towns have, on a per capita or per 100,000 residents basis, some of the highest incidence of coronavirus, because the nature of those hotspots has made those very dangerous places to be right now. And I think that we all have an obligation to pay attention not only to our immediate communities, but to those places, as you point out, Mustafa, are farther out.
It's also true that, I mean, if you're incarcerated, you don't have a choice. But if you work in a prison or if you work in a meatpacking plant, this is going to look to you, whether it's true or not, like your health versus your family's financial future versus the ability to keep a roof over your kid's head, to bring food home. I don't know that it's necessarily accurate to sort of set those two things in conflict with one another, but a lot of people have been encouraged to look at it this way, and it's understandable. I mean, so many people, 2 weeks without a paycheck and they are out on the street. So they're not able to make a lot of choices that we in sort of positions of privilege are able to make for ourselves. And I think it's important to remember that not everybody has a bank account with a few months salary waiting for them in case something happens.
Chris makes such an important point. The 3,000 employees of that meatpacking plant are all, or are almost all, immigrants who have absolutely no choice but to go to work because they've got nothing if they don't go to work. So they don't have the luxury to stay home because they're concerned, or even if they get sick, right? I mean, the inequality in our society and the inequality of the choices that we all make is really coming into full relief in the middle of this.
Yeah. Eric, I have a question here that's from Richard saying, how will you hold up or hold accountable the owners of the meatpacking plants, the people that make decisions at prisons? Like, at the end of the day, we're just seeing that public putting spotlight on from a public standpoint is what gets changed, right? Whether it's when we talk about the prisons or we talk about the meatpacking plants. Yeah. What is that focus in newsrooms today?
Well, my colleagues, I'll plug my colleagues, Gabrielle Banks and St. John, Brown and Smith, who put out a report today on the outbreak in the Harris County prisons. They also did a piece that kind of accompanied it. I'll send the link in the chat feature in a second, but it's a story on the outbreak itself, but also a story on how they did report that story and how they were able to talk to inmates, not only during the pandemic, but while they're in jail, in prison. So as Evan says, I mean, Alexa's story was great. I mean, exposing the truth, just reporting the facts, reporting the truth. When it's truth, we can kind of all agree, why would a meatpacking plant turn down tests for its employees? That can have an impact, and that feels really good when it does, not in a bad situation, but it feels good when you can make some difference for those employees. But for us, for now, I think just exposing things that are going wrong, we can all agree are going wrong, or asking questions about why things are going the way they're going, it does have some impact as far as instigating change.
Are we seeing more investigative journalism in general in terms of on a budget line? Are we seeing more of that?
We always do a fair amount of that, I mean, on different teams. So, and it's been a focus for us in the newsroom. Of course, this pandemic has introduced some new challenges to the investigative reporting, but we're still able to do quite a bit of that actually through records, through phone research and so on.
As we're kind of wrapping up our time in a little bit, I want to ask from each of you, what's been the most interesting interview that you've done during COVID-19? Like who has just went like, what?
So, I mean, we've done a lot. I looked on my schedule, and we've done 30 COVID interviews since mid-February, and we have to sort of balance. It can't be all COVID all the time, or you're going to lose people who need a break. But we talked to a guy named Frank Snowden, who wrote a book about pandemics down through the ages, and as it happened, he was caught in Italy when things broke out there and got really, really serious. So he has written about literally from the Black Death until the present moment. And then he found himself, and he's in his 70s, so he found himself very much sheltering in place. And his perspective was very interesting, the way that pandemics end up reshaping the societies that they affect in the aftermath, that everyone thinks they're over when the last person gets sick, and it's always a matter of years for the economy to sort of settle into where it's going to be, for culture to settle. There's always, societies always deal with a lot of scapegoating, and unfortunately, the least among us are often the people who suffer the most. And so his perspective on things, and then on kind of living this thing that he's been studying academically for the better part of his career, was really interesting. His book, by the way, his name is Frank Snowden, and of course I won't be able to find it on this list right now, Epidemics in Society from the Black Death to the Present. The book doesn't include COVID, but it's a fascinating primer if you like kind of nerdy background to give context to what we're looking at now.
Actually, Chris, I was going to ask, I was wondering this yesterday or this morning with you and Evan. You're two of the state's great interviewers, I think. So have you noticed any difference in your interviewing during this pandemic? I mean, as people are shut up in their houses and kind of socially isolated, are you finding different interviews, more reflective interviews, more stressed out interviewees? How has that changed for you guys?
I'm hearing a lot of dogs barking and 4-year-olds, hitting the doorknob. But I think in some ways, we typically put people in a studio because the sound quality is much better. We insist on it. Now we had a guy using his daughter's like Frozen headset so that he could get decent sound. I think in some ways, people are are more relaxed and candid because they're in a physically comfortable space, but I also think they get distracted easily because they're not in a studio where they're surrounded by 4 blank walls. They've got their computer, and occasionally you hear people kind of getting distracted.
I think, Erica, the humanity of people has come out. You know, we're all kind of hardened combatants on the field of battle. You know, you're not allowed to have human relationships with people on the other side of the microphone. Yeah. And I've actually made a point over the last 10 weeks of reaching out to people I know in elective office or people I know in positions of public responsibility and said, look, I mean, literally have said, this is not a journalist text. This is a human being text. How are you? One of the things that I hope persists, and I'm cynical enough to believe it absolutely won't, is that in this period of time, we've all come to treat one another more as humans. And the humanity of things has come out. You know, I've really enjoyed seeing people's houses on television when they've gone on TV. My friends who are journalists or in politics, when they go on the cable television shows, I'm like, man, that's a nice kitchen. You know, I'm getting decorating ideas. Actually, that's definitely one part. You asked about an interview. I guess Mustafa asked. Yeah. I interviewed Congressman Chip Roy of Austin down to San Antonio for the Tribune. It was a real emblem to me. I like Chip Roy personally. Chip Roy was formerly Ted Cruz's chief of staff. He was formerly first assistant attorney general of Texas. He ran for a seat that was vacated by Lamar Smith, who retired, and he won this seat. And he's in a pitched battle with Wendy Davis in the fall to retain control of this, what has been a Republican seat historically, but he only won by a margin just slightly larger than Ted Cruz beat Beto O'Rourke in 2018. He is rare among conservatives in my experience in this era, in that he will talk to anybody, he will answer any question, he will go before any camera. He doesn't play the whole MSM game, lamestream media. Yeah. And so I've interviewed him a bunch of times, and we did an interview the other day from his place out in west of Austin, and we talked about the coronavirus. There is really back to our earlier point, there is really a Democrats are from Mars, Republicans are from Venus aspect to this. Chip Roy believes what Chip Roy believes, and God bless him for believing what he believes, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, but he is on his message. And he was open up the state before opening up the state was cool. And he has a whole bunch of thoughts about the way that the government is running, Congress is running, why are we not back to work, and, you know, Nancy Pelosi and the way we've approached people. I appreciated that interview because it just put into, to me, it was very stark, the differences in politics that exist and how two sides see the same set of facts in such different ways. That to me was a very clarifying and reaffirming sense of what the world is like today.
Erica?
You know, I probably most personally enjoyed the interviews with scientists, right? I mean, we've been able to talk to a lot of them. I usually don't as a journalist. I usually do a lot of politics, and I've been nice to take a break from that. So I've learned a lot about immune systems. I learned, for example, that bats are often the source of these viruses because they have a very good immune system themselves. So they can harbor a virus for a long time. It's been fun. And a sort of interesting interview I had was with one of our other Lyceum alumni, Ted Cruz, who was in quarantine, self-quarantine. So I had the idea to call him up while he was in self-quarantine. And, you know, he is so thoughtful, so measured, so precise in his language, and it scared me a bit. I mean, he was kind of struck the right tone. And this is at a point early on in the pandemic when the tone he was taking, not the tone being taken by the president, for example, and it just kind of really struck me then that, you know, he's worried, he's taking this very seriously, and hopefully that'll be an attitude that, you know, is noted by other members of Congress. So.
Do you think, Erica, that Cruz is still measured and now, since he's out of quarantine and back in the world? He seems very Ted Cruz-y to me at the moment.
I thought he was going to, well, yeah, on social media he is, you know, so I was kind of thinking, oh, he's going to like tell some dad jokes and like joke about like Princess Bride and like Oscar had his haircut and so on, his beard. No, he was sort of very, you know, I took all precautions, and so it was yeah.
Evan talked about that we are more human, and Erica talked about bats. I want to connect those two thoughts. Bats, as I've learned, are the largest flying mammals. And so because they fly, they feel that exhaustion, right? And in that time, the immune system is down. And that's what makes the viruses more lethal that comes out of bats. Because a lot of the viruses in the past, you know, a couple of decades have been related back to bats. So, you know, in essence, when we are at our most vulnerable, right, you know, we can be hurt. But when we are at our most vulnerable, that's when we connect.
Mm.
And so I envy all of you because I think you are superb interiors, and you allow people to go into a space to reveal something that they generally don't get to reveal. I've seen each of you do that in different ways. I've seen that come out in your columns, Erica. I've seen it, I've heard it in the interviews that you've done. And Evan, sometimes I don't know if you're going to beat them with a stick or if you're going to hug them, but somehow or the other, you pull out nuggets that not just make it memorable, but allow us to understand public policy better. So I am grateful for all of you and what you do. Your profession is certainly being challenged right now. But from where I sit, and from many of us sit, that it's rising to the occasion. So when Jefferson says, paraphrasing, the government or the newspaper, he would chase the newspaper. So would I. So as we end this, what are your parting thoughts for the Texas Lyceum? And tell us which class you're in, and any message that you have for your Lyceum mates. I'll start with you, Erica.
Okay. Well, I am class of 13, lucky 13. If I haven't met you yet, I look forward to doing so, hopefully in person at some point in the not too distant future. And thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Evan and Chris, for having this discussion today, and for all of you for joining us. It's a privilege to be in a position to tell the stories, to hear people talk and reflect on their experiences. I feel lucky I'm able to do it still after all these years, and as we all are. And so any stories you have, if you want to reach out to me, I think any of the other panelists too, I look forward to hearing from you. And stay safe out there.
Chris?
Well, Evan said, we are all in it together as journalists. I think we're all in it together as Texans, members of the Lyceum and beyond. We're all in this together as Americans. I think if we can find a way to set aside the things we don't like about one another, we will be much stronger. But that's hard to do when we're afraid. And we just have to sort of acknowledge and confront the fact that people are afraid. They're made particularly uncomfortable by uncertainty, and we can't, none of us with the best reporting possible can offer people any certainty at this moment. Scientists can't do it, doctors can't do it, politicians can't do it, and journalists can't do it. So we have to kind of acknowledge that and recognize that we do still have, I think, power to help one another and look after one another, and kind of recognize that there's no good reason. The enemy is COVID-19. It's not one another.
Evan?
And I'm class of 09.
09. All right.
Good class.
So I was class of 2011, and I enjoyed my time in the Lyceum so much. I will say that I was resistant initially to getting involved in another organization with meetings that you had to go to, and you don't go to this many meetings, they're going to kick you out. I brag all the time to people in other states about the Lyceum. It was one of the very best experiences I've ever had in all the years I've been on this earth. And the people I met in the Lyceum, my class and other classes, are some of the best people I'll ever know. It's a very meaningful organization where you get to know people at all levels, different people you never would have had the opportunity to encounter before. And it's enriched me enormously because it's widened my perspective on the world. And so it's an honor to get to be here today, to be back as an alum. I adore Erica Greeter and adore Chris Boyd, have such respect for them. I even think you're okay too, Mustafa. And I appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you all. Let's get through this and see you on the other side.
Well, as we end, I'll remind Evan, I was at the Texas Tribune, I don't recall what for, and we're talking about the Texas Lyceum, and you looked at me, you go like, you're not going to try to get somebody to write a letter for you. I'll write you your letter. So how I got to the Texas Lyceum was your kind hand to pull me in. Thank you all, not just for being on the interview today, but for all that you do for Texas. You make this state, and you are the jewels of this state. So
thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Nice to talk to all of you.